The United Nations has verified today that there have been more than 5,000 civilian deaths in the war in Yemen, mainly from airstrikes by a Saudi-led coalition, and it says that an international investigation is urgently needed. You may have heard recently on The World at One an audio diary kept for us by the UN's humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, Jamie McGoldrick. He recorded it throughout the last 4 months. Here are some extracts.
You'd have to think that in this modern world that level of cruelty shouldn't exist, and there should be a time where the international community and others ask the question, is enough is enough. The terrible suffering of innocent people in Yemen has been on for us. They've endured it for over 2 years. And people have lost hope. Yemenis are very affable, very hardy, very resilient people. But there's only so much you can take, grinding poverty, grinding conflict, being trapped in your own country, the inability to move, no future prospects, the military campaign continuing, conflict continuing, and no prospects of politics on the horizon.
Jamie McGoldrick from the UN. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn joined us in the studio this lunchtime for a wide-ranging interview, which we'll hear more of later. But I began by asking about Yemen and what he made of those audio diaries.
They're alive, they're real, they're human, and he manages to give us the personal accounts of what's going on and that brilliant vision, as well as talking about the huge geopolitical issues that are involved in Yemen. I think it's absolutely brilliant that he's doing it, and it's great that a person with such obvious humanitarian instincts is the one there representing the UN.
And drawing attention, of course, amongst other things, but to the rise in the outbreak of cholera. More than 540,000 suspected cases have been reported, with so many deaths as well, 2,000.
Cholera is a wholly preventable disease. It is a consequence of disruption, of war, of pollution. It doesn't have to happen anywhere. And the idea that the bombing continues, the military campaign continues, whilst completely innocent children are dying of cholera in inadequate hospitals, and those that need medical attention elsewhere have trouble getting out of the country to get it, and that those medicines that are desperately needed can't come in, and so then a black market develops in medicines and so on, and then it ends up with the most desperately poor suffering the worst.
The UK government, along with many others, is attempting to send aid to Yemen.
Well, we are attempting to send aid to Yemen, and of course that is good. Anyone sending aid to Yemen has got to be good, but in reality there has to be a ceasefire urgently. There has to be a cessation of hostilities. There has to be a peace process. In the meantime, we're selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Those arms are being dropped on Yemen, and at the same time we're sending aid in from the Department of International Development. We should not be doing both. We should be sending aid in and ensuring there's a political process to bring about a ceasefire and bring about a longer-term political settlement. Britain is supposed to be drafting a UN resolution for the Security Council on this subject. They've been a year with a draft somewhere.
Well, it can be very difficult, as we know, to get UN Security Council resolutions, can't it?
I don't doubt how difficult it is. I don't underestimate for 1 second how difficult it is. But if we at least said we will no longer supply these arms to Saudi Arabia that are being used as part of the military campaign, and instead we will put everything we can into bringing about a political solution and continue trying to get a UN resolution, that's got to be the right way forward. We can't be spectators of children dying of cholera.
The government would argue that by working closely with Saudi Arabia, and that includes selling arms, we can encourage them on human rights, and they would say that there has actually been some progress on that.
Well, they've often said this, but the reality is that human rights in Saudi Arabia are extremely limited. The Saudi military and political campaign on Yemen has continued, and so it would suggest that our influence is extremely limited. Donald Trump's now close relationship with the Saudi government, of course, doesn't help either. But surely the world needs to know the extent of the crisis in Yemen, because unfortunately crises around the world are seen through the prism of what the media chooses to report, and I congratulate the BBC on running this series. Most media media outlets are not reporting what's happening in the Yemen. Keith Vaz, an MP who was born in the Yemen, has raised the issue consistently in Parliament, and he himself tried to visit Yemen but wasn't able to get in recently. But he's often made the point that there has to be a full understanding of the true horrors of what's going on there. And I think Jamie McGoldrick's reports help to do that.
Well, let me put another argument to you that the government stated again, one that's rather closer to home, and that's by having an incredibly close security cooperation, the government says, with Saudi Arabia, actually helps people here because it prevents violence on British streets, prevents terrorism.
We have to prevent terrorism on the streets of this country just as much as we would want to prevent terrorism on the streets of any other country. And I think we have to insist on that cooperation. But what's happening is that people in the Yemen are being terrorized by Saudi bombs dropped from above. So the two things have to be taken into account on this. And I think the pressure on Saudi Arabia should be much stronger.
But what about Iran? This is a proxy war too, and Theresa May says we've got to work together to push back against Iran's aggressive regional actions.
Iran must be included in the equation, as must all countries within the region, and that is where Britain's role ought to be much stronger. We are tasked with drafting a resolution to go to the UN, but there has to be something done, and done quickly.
Do you think that the UK would be a better country if it didn't have an arms industry at all?
I think we sell far too many arms to countries that abuse human rights, and our Parliament ought to reconvene its Arms Control Export Licensing Committee. It's not in operation, and we should be quite serious about it. If we want to prevent arms made in Britain being used to kill innocent people and abuse human rights, then we have to be prepared to do something about it.
But you'll know, and the trade unions will say this to you, how many jobs depend on it? Hundreds of thousands, £6 billion worth of exports.
I fully appreciate the size and enormity of the arms industry and the need for working with industry to protect those jobs, in some cases by arms conversion work, but above all, we have to look at the consequences of a vast amount of arms sales to Saudi Arabia and what's happening in Yemen and what's happened in the past in Bahrain.
On Yemen, do you think that going ahead with your policy as stated, stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia, would that create too much of a divergence with our close ally, the United States?
I think it would be a very important message to the United States, and I think many in the House and the Senate would recognise that if a Security Council member like Britain takes that decision, then they've done it for a reason, and I think it would strengthen the argument of many in the United States that are also concerned about pouring more and more arms into Saudi Arabia.
What's your own attitude towards the current United States government? Francis O'Grady at the TUC this morning has said they're planning a protest against Donald Trump. You go on many demonstrations. Would you be tempted to join that one?
Well, I've many disagreements with Donald Trump, which I've made very clear, particularly about the climate change agreement and particular issues of the need for peace in Korea. But also I was concerned at the remarks he made after Charlottesville. I think we need to have a robust relationship with the US president.
So you might go on the protest?
Well, I didn't know there was a protest being organised, so no doubt an invitation will come its way.
Jeremy Corbyn, we asked to speak to someone from the Foreign Office about Yemen, but they told us no one was available. They provided this statement.
The UK is the third largest donor to Yemen, having committed over £139 million in UK aid this year. We are also playing a leading role in diplomatic efforts to achieve a political solution. The intervention by the Saudi Arabian-led coalition came at the request of Yemen's internationally recognised president, whose government was forced to flee following a violent takeover by the Houthi rebel group. Since then, rebels have launched missile attacks into Saudi Arabia and committed serious human rights violations. UK defence exports are kept under careful and continual review.
Returning now to that interview with Jeremy Corbyn, we went on to discuss Labour's position on leaving the European Union. Tonight, MPs will vote on whether to allow the bill, which would take the UK out of the EU, to proceed through Parliament. Labour's told its MPs to vote against it, arguing it amounts to a power grab by ministers in its current form. This despite the party's stated position to respect the result of last year's referendum. That's not the only intriguing aspect to Labour's approach. The party's shadow Brexit secretary, Sir Keir Starmer, has recently shifted policy to allow a transitional deal, which would mean the UK staying in the single market for a fixed period of time. That means accepting the free movement of goods, services and people. Sir Keir Starmer also said it would mean staying in the customs union. That means that the UK couldn't negotiate its own trade deals and would have to accept the EU's own agreements with other countries. I asked Jeremy Corbyn whether, in principle, there were any circumstances in which the UK could stay in the EU under a Labour government.
We've had a referendum. It voted to leave the EU. We voted to trigger Article 50. I think we have to make an effective and close relationship with Europe. Half our trade is with Europe. A very large number of British people live in Europe, or European nationals live here and married to each other. I see a close relationship with Europe, not a rival to Europe on the shores.
But, you know, there was an anti-Brexit march in London on Saturday. Many of your supporters would like you to become the pro-Remain party, 70% of Labour voters. Are there no circumstances that you can envisage that the UK could remain part of the EU?
Labour is in a position which is more complicated than any other party in that a majority of our Labour voters from 2015 voted to remain, and the same I'm sure would apply in 2017, but a substantial minority voted to leave. There was a referendum, and I think we have to respect the result of the referendum. I want to build a relationship with Europe, and I want to work in Europe, a Europe that works for the many, not the few, and remain a member of the European institutions. We're obviously going to be forever signed up, I hope, to the European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention of Human Rights, but there are many other EU-related agencies that we should be members of and ensure that this close relationship of manufacturing industry and universities remains, and the close relationship of peoples across Europe remains.
Then what about in the shorter term? There's been a recent shift in Labour's position so that you would agree to stay in both the single market and the customs union after 2019.
We're looking at the negotiations that are going on. The leave date is set as March 2019. I don't see how it is possible to reach agreement on all the trade issues that are so necessary between now and then, and the danger of in March 2019 going straight onto World Trade Organization rules and the tariffs coming in immediately wouldn't have a very damaging effect to a huge amount of industries in this country, for manufacture as well as financial services, and all the problems it would bring for pretty well every university that has relations with Europe. So what we've said is there should be a continued membership of those two institutions during a transition period.
And how long might that last?
Well, it's not open-ended. It has to be specific in the sense you should do it as long as necessary and as short as possible. A lot of people have suggested various times for it. I think it would mean that the negotiations could continue onwards and we could come to an agreement then on the future trading relationship with Europe. What I want to see is a continuation of the high levels of trade with Europe, continuation of university and relationship with Europe, which is so important, but also we have working conditions which are all under threat in this Brexit bill that the government has put forward. We have consumer rights that are under threat. We have environmental regulations that are under threat. We have to be much more serious about this than simply ramming through Parliament a bill sometime late tonight is what they're trying to do, which would actually hand all these decisions over to David Davis.
Oh, and it looks like that you might be facing some Labour rebellions on that.
I hope Labour MPs will recognise that we fought the election, recognising the result of the referendum, and that we would seek a tariff-free trade access to European markets in the future, and we would seek parliamentary scrutiny of the whole negotiation process. What this bill does is takes away it.
But Caroline Flynn said that a defeat for the bill would cause huge problems, and she does believe that we need to respect the outcome of the referendum.
She and I both voted to implement Article 50, and that means respecting the result of the referendum. It doesn't mean handing over all our powers of scrutiny in Parliament and all our decision-making on how the negotiations proceed to one Secretary of State away from parliamentary scrutiny. This is a power grab by the government at the expense of our democratically elected Parliament.
Just returning to Labour's position on the single market, the TUC has been saying today that they believe in staying in the single market, but also leaving open the possibility of it being on a permanent basis, as some countries now do, Norway, for example.
I obviously meet with the TUC, and I'm attending the TUC tomorrow. There has to be a trade relationship with Europe, whether that is formally within the single market or whether that is an agreement to trade within the single market, I think is open for discussion and negotiation. But the principle has to be...
So it could be like Norway, we could stay in the single market indefinitely?
The major manufacturing industries in Britain, car industry, aircraft and so on, all have huge supply chains across Europe. Food processing industry, massive supply chains across Europe and massive processing stuff. A lot of companies work on both sides. There has to be an agreement that those relationships can continue. Otherwise, a lot of jobs are at risk in this country.
I'm sure everybody would agree they want those relationships to continue, but just for the sake of clarity, that could mean staying in the single market indefinitely.
We want a relationship which allows us to trade within the single market, whether that's formal membership, which is only possible, I believe, if you're actually a member of the EU, or whether it's an agreed trading relationship, is open for discussion. The outcome is more important than the nomenclature on the way.
Of course, what that would mean in either of those scenarios you describe is agreeing to uncontrolled immigration from the EU, wouldn't it?
The issue of free movement has been brought up. What we've always said is that the undercutting of working conditions anywhere is very damaging to the workforce in the construction industry, manufacturing industry, processing, or any other kind of industry. And it's the power of employers that have been allowed to bring in wholesale groups of workers who have been then grossly exploited themselves, and others in this country also exploited, and they've lost their jobs in some cases. And so it is about working conditions. It is about employment conditions.
It's not purely about working conditions, is it? There are people may object to uncontrolled immigration on other grounds as well. And if you agree to access to the single market, staying in the single market, then you will have to agree to freedom of movement, won't you? From
well, there has to be a managed migration based on needs of people and needs of economy. What we don't want is what is grotesquely exploitative, groups of people brought in from relatively lower income economies to do jobs in this country at a rate of pay that simply is not sustainable. So we need, I keep saying this, proper regulation of the labour market in this country as well.
I assume you're aware of what the figures are for net migration at the moment.
Well, net migration figures are changing quite a lot, and they've actually gone down quite a lot, and that is probably a reflection of what's the atmosphere that's happening around Brexit. But there's
Just
also
let our listeners know what the figure is.
There's also huge problems of recruitment of staff within the National Health Service, and the NHS staffing crisis is a very serious one, and that again is a product of uncertainty. And so we do have to be aware of all this.
Well, exactly, and there's a lot of concern in the country around it, which is why I want to be clear that you yourself know what the figure for net migration is at the moment.
I'm well aware it's come down from 300,000. It's lower than that.
It is. It's around 250,000 now. Is that an acceptable level?
We need workers to come into this country as well, because we do have labour shortages in some areas. We certainly have skill shortages, and some of this is a product of the lack of investment in this country in skill training in many sectors of industry as well. And so if we didn't have European workers in our NHS and education and quite a lot of manufacturing industry, then we would be in a much worse position productivity-wise than we are at the present time. We can't walk away from the idea that we don't have problems that have been a long time coming because we haven't invested enough in this in our own economy.
Do you welcome Tony Blair's intervention on this issue yesterday?
I watched Tony Blair's interview yesterday with interest.
Just with interest?
Well, I'm always interested.
But you don't support his position?
No, because he seemed not to understand the economic policies of the Labour Party, and I was surprised at that.
What he was arguing was that it's possible to have tougher rules on freedom of movement without the need for hard Brexit.
I'm not quite sure what he means by that. If he agrees with me on the question of undercutting of workers by the attacks on workers' conditions, then okay. But he didn't specify what he meant by that. But I'm not quite sure what the point of his interview was yesterday, actually.
There does seem to be some incoherence in the Labour position, because you have Tom Watson's arguing that we should be part of the customs union, possibly permanently. Keir Starmer saying that the UK should consider staying in the customs union indefinitely. And then Barry Gardiner, another senior person in the party, saying that would be a disaster.
There's a great deal of coherence in the position, and that is we accept the result of the referendum. We want tariff-free trade access with Europe. We want a close relationship with Europe in the future. We're not setting up some Singapore-style economy on the shores of Europe. And some colleagues sometimes think aloud about what's possible or not possible in the future. Our position is we'll oppose the bill tonight because we want parliamentary scrutiny. We want democratic accountability of an elected government in how it reacts to the results of the referendum. And that's why we're voting the way we are tonight, and I urge all colleagues to do the same. It's quite specific in our amendments that we set out the issues surrounding trade, surrounding conditions, and surrounding protection of workers' rights and consumer rights. I wouldn't want to hand all those decisions over to David Davis.
Let me ask you now about your own plans for the future. We've had a clear answer from Theresa May. She says she is going to fight the next election. That might not be until 2022. How about you?
I'm absolutely fine. I've been out campaigning all summer already, and I'm ready for it. I don't think it's going to be 2022. I think it'll be a lot sooner than that.
Sooner than that, but if it is 2022, you'd definitely still be leading the party.
I'm fit and healthy. Don't worry about that.
Oh, I didn't raise the question of your fitness.
No, no. Our party is in good heart. Our membership is increased even further since the general election, and we're campaigning very hard on economic issues, on issues of social justice and issues of public sector pay and of people's real security in their lives. And our conference in Brighton is going to be probably the biggest conference we've ever held.
You've certainly been on an incredible political journey, haven't you, from being a Labour backbencher to wowing the crowds at Glastonbury, people chanting your name to White Stripes songs. Recently, you said you've been campaigning, you've been making bath bombs. What's next? Any invitations on Strictly?
No, I've vowed I will always keep well away from anything involved with individuals, including me, dancing.
Why not?
Do you really want to know? My dancing is terrible.
Have you had any time for any of your other hobbies, your drain spotting or your allotment?
Oh, the allotment is in good fettle. It's fine. I was there yesterday afternoon. I have to say it was raining most of the time I was there, but that's what makes it much more fun. Harvesting maize, digging up potatoes, bringing home vast quantities of beans and spinach, all good, and good for health. Good for everybody I give the stuff to, and enjoyable to do as well.
You've got time to do that as well as being Labour leader?
You have to make time to make sure you have a balance in your life. If you just do one thing, you don't necessarily do it very well. If you do other things in your life, it helps you to think about things. It also helps you to understand the natural process, understand why things grow, how things grow. Harold Wilson once said, the most important thing in the world is somebody who can grow 10 tons of corn where only 8 tons grew before.